5, 4, 3, 2,
1.
Thunderbirds
I'll
are
go.
Bum, ba, ba, da, bum, 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 bum,
Etc.
Hello, and welcome to another long-awaited episode of Revolutionary Despatches. I'm Katherine, Wright.
And I'm David Bryan.
It's been both too long and not that long.
Yeah. In a funny old way.
Yeah, so we hadn't recorded since about 2019.
For a long time. Yeah.
And then I had essentially failed to ever get around to editing that episode because I was in the middle of a massive mental crisis, and that didn't go so well. Our last actual episode was out in sort of 2018.
2018, yeah. Back when Brexit was the most important thing in the world.
Yeah, back when that was the only topic of conversation in political space. So our last episode was the 8th of June, 20. I say we did record more recently than that. And then we recorded again more recently still, actually just over a week ago.
Yeah.
But due to some technical difficulties, for which you may read, I forgot to make sure that Audacity was recording via my actual podcast microphone. And instead, I recorded the entire 3-hour recording session using my webcam microphone that was not only bad and at quite some distance from my face, but was also pointing away from me because I turn my webcam around when I'm not actively using it. Yeah. So, yep. My apologies mostly to David for wasting 3 hours of his time. But also to all of you for depriving you of Revolutionary Despatches content for another week.
Yeah.
You must have been...
People were fine with it for the previous 2 years, but that extra week, that's
it really
what pushed
was,
it over the line.
Yeah, they're all going to hate us now. So, our ambition for this episode is to try and uncover all of the key points that we made last week, plus some new ones on things that have happened since, and then to talk about...
Some things that have happened since. Yeah.
Yes, we'll get to that. And then to talk about the upcoming US general election, which is due on November the 3rd. We're recording this on Halloween.
We are, spooky.
By the time you hear it, it will probably be the 2nd of November. I imagine it will take me a couple of hours. If you're hearing this not on Monday, then I was wrong. Either I got it done more quickly than I thought, or it took me longer. But
so either we're pleased that it's gone well, or you can just enjoy the irony.
Yeah. I suppose as long as it's out by Tuesday,
that
will be okay, because that's still before the results will be in. Well, I mean, as we'll probably
who knows? We'll come to that.
Yeah. But So, and also the other piece of housekeeping, which I did go over last week, but then was lost into the ether of my terrible webcam mic, is that I am still the same person.
Oh yeah.
That I was. David hasn't taken over the show and replaced his co-host with some kind of robot imposter. I
haven't suspended you from the podcast on dubious grounds.
We said we'd get to that. Yeah, so I have, how they say, trans my agenda. So
it's happened.
Yeah,
this can happen.
You spend long enough in left-wing politics, and there's a decent chance. The problem is like I can hear what I said last time in the back of my head, and I keep sort of saying the same things but in slightly different ways, and this is fucking with my head.
It's like some part of you thinks, I better phrase it differently for a bit of variety, but no one's heard what we said last week.
No.
So it doesn't matter.
I am thinking about editing down your half of the audio into a special David cast where it's just you talking for an hour.
Yeah, totally. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, it can be...
Sort of a lot of it would make no sense, because...
I can sort of, like, interject newly recorded segments where I sort of say a sentence or two to set up what you're about to say. I am considering doing that. It would be a fair bit of work. It would actually be more work, probably, than
especially at the moment,
a regular episode.
Do, so...
Yes. But we'll see. Anyway, so...
Maybe an Easter egg.
Well, Halloween egg, indeed.
Yeah, well, yeah. That's a pumpkin.
Yeah. A pumpkin.
Yeah.
Halloween eggs are... Don't talk to me about pumpkins. I've had leaky pumpkins today.
Not a euphemism.
Everyone. No, absolutely not. I wish it were.
I don't know what it would mean, but...
Yeah, no, neither do I, but it would probably be easier to deal with than rotten pumpkin juice leaking all over the kitchen, which is what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
Along with the shower leaking through the ceiling via a light fitting. It's been a day, and it's only 4 p.m. I think we must have angered the Halloween spirits.
Yeah, that'd be what it is.
Samhain.
You buy a pumpkin but don't carve it.
Well, we were going to,
they'll come and
but then
destroy
it died.
Yeah, right.
We just didn't realise to what extent it had died.
Yeah.
We probably should have got rid of it earlier. Anyway.
I think we covered that story.
I think we have. That is, as far as I'm concerned, that's one of the most major stories of the last few weeks, because it happened to me and I got my hands covered in pumpkin juice. But let's have a look. So we should probably start with the big story of the last year.
Yeah. Let's ease in with something light, which is the apocalypse.
For those of you listening to this so blissfully far in the future, you have forgotten or were never aware.
Like in the future, when this podcast has become a canonical sort of classic of culture, people continue to study it.
When little baby socialists are sort of, learning this at the knee along with Marx and Kropotkin. Coronavirus is a thing, which is this really, it's a nasty viral pneumonia type thing, which came from bats, probably, and then infected humans, maybe via pangolins, and is killing everyone. I think over a million people have died worldwide. There's been 10 million cases in Europe. We just passed that milestone this morning. I don't know what the worldwide cases are off the top of my head, but it's not going. Friends, Romans,
it's not
countrymen.
Good. Yeah,
it's not going well. I'm trying not to use ladies and gentlemen because it's exclusionary of non-binary people. But so I'm thinking of friends, Romans, countrymen.
That's good.
Falling back on that old one.
Comrades is good. I think.
Comrades is good.
Citizens.
Comrades is good, but it needs more. The thing is with comrades is
you don't want. Sometimes you want to address a group of people, not all of whom are comrades.
That's true. And then also, I think it's just it doesn't have the same sort of feel as something like ladies and gentlemen or friends, Romans, countrymen. It's too short. It needs to be something to pair with comrades. I can't think of anything.
Haters and losers.
Yeah, that's the alternative. You're either a comrade or you're a loser. Yeah. Way. We have fun.
This is a very side point. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I wonder to what extent has Trump being president affected the human? I suppose it is human. What I mean to say is the English language. Because people speak differently now, don't they? People use phrases that I strongly suspect that people use the word tremendous more than they.
That seems quite likely. I certainly don't think I ever would have sort of used the word bigly for the advent of Donald Trump.
Yeah. It'd be good if haters and losers becomes because that's where I'm getting that from.
Of course, we could reappropriate it for the left.
Anyway.
Yes, indeed. So, coronavirus, bad, killing everyone, not good. We are speaking currently, as contemporary listeners will know, in the middle of the sort of ramping up of the second wave, so-called. Not that the first wave ever really ended, but the second sort of spike in cases. And things are going interestingly. So basically the government of the United Kingdom, and more specifically the government of the United Kingdom, in its capacity as the English government, has chosen to approach this second build-up of cases on a local, region-by-region basis. And, well, there's a bunch of stories today in the papers about how Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is now considering having to implement a national lockdown despite his desire because the data is so damning. So that shows you about how well that's gone.
I mean, what struck me recently, as this second wave goes, is how many aspects of the dynamics of how this has moved into the second wave parallel things which happened in the first wave. You've got other European countries starting to have to move into proper lockdowns again. France has recently announced some very stringent restrictions, which are very similar to what happened in the first wave. And yet, despite the fact that Britain is on the same trajectory as countries like France, Belgium, Italy, whatever, the government is dragging its feet and not going into a lockdown, even though probably we're going to have to at some point, which means that our second wave is going to be worse, going to be more economic damage. All of this happened the first time.
Yeah.
They haven't learned anything.
No. Well, yeah, I mean, and people, scientists in particular, epidemiologists, medical doctors, have been calling for what they've been calling a 2-week circuit breaker lockdown for weeks. And Labour eventually came around to back that policy as well. But now it's too late. I mean,
of the 4 nations of the UK, England's the only one which hasn't done it.
Yeah. Is that true? Has Scotland done it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I knew Wales had.
Right, maybe I'm
Scotland
wrong, but I'm pretty sure.
But yeah. But I remember I was reading an article earlier today, but I was interviewing a bunch of sort of professors of epidemiology, and they were all saying, yeah, it's too late now. 2 weeks wouldn't do anything, or wouldn't do nearly enough.
That's the point of a circuit breaker, is to get the cases down whilst they're still quite low, so that you don't have to go into a lockdown for very long.
Yeah. But people are now saying, I think the current estimate is that in the most recent week of data that they've been able to look at, so I think that's the week commencing the 23rd of October, approximately 500,000 people in the UK have been infected. That's an estimate, of course, because it's extrapolating from tests that we have done into parts of the population that haven't been tested. But still, I mean, 500,000 is, in a week, clearly this is...
And that's huge.
Yeah, it's bad.
Because the really worrying thing is the rate at which the disease can grow. And so if it's being increased by that amount, that's what's really worrying.
Yeah. They're now talking about, I think the lockdown that's being floated is probably going to last at least until December, so that's a month. And I suspect, I think if they bring a lockdown in now, I can't see cases getting down towards a safe level before Christmas. And of course, people will be desperate to have some semblance, however much they can get, of normality over Christmas.
Yeah.
So I think the government will be under a lot of pressure.
There are people who often people see family and friends and people that they don't see most of the year at Christmas, because that's kind of what Christmas is all about. Especially this year, that's true. There are people who have deliberately, as it were, cut themselves off from people that normally they might see 2 or 3 times throughout the year. Normally that's not enough, and we need Christmas to reconnect with people that we only see very occasionally throughout most of the year. Whereas this year, people haven't seen each other at all.
And it's entirely possible, even quite likely, I think, that they won't be able to see most of those people at Christmas.
Yeah.
And, of course, not everyone celebrates Christmas, and I know that Eid was scuppered in many places by the imposition of sort of local lockdowns, I think, in Manchester, among other places.
Yeah, I remember that.
So some communities have already had this sort of happen to them. But I think, definitely most people in the United Kingdom, even people who aren't Christian, which I don't think either of us are, particularly.
Not terribly,
no. Still celebrate Christmas and still have it as their sort of main sort of holiday period, even if they don't celebrate it for theological reasons. I mean, that's true of many Muslims as well. I have Muslim friends from school who used to celebrate Christmas, because why wouldn't they? It's great.
Yeah, right.
Christmas is good. They've got Jesus in the Quran. It's certified.
That's a good point, actually. There's a certain amount of theological basis.
No, it's bad. I mean, and so the problem that has been the kind of patchy way that the lockdowns have been run in England specifically has led to situations whereby you have places that are in tier 2 restrictions don't get the funding to support them that places that are in tier 3 would get, which means that in many places who have been stuck in tier 2 restrictions, like Birmingham until recently, I think, they have been sort of desperate to be moved up to tier 3 because they're desperate for the funding. Whereas other places, such as obviously Manchester, with Andy Burnham, obviously has been in the news a lot, sort of railing against the imposition of tier 3 restrictions, because he thinks that the support that's given under tier 3, whilst certainly significantly more than you get under tier 2 isn't enough and doesn't make up for the increased restrictions.
It's nothing like what we got nationwide in the first round.
No.
So a clear example of that is the fact that furlough, when it is reintroduced, is at, 60%, 2/3 of your wages? Something like that?
Yes. As
Whereas
opposed
in the
to
first round it was 80%. And I think it's still the case that the Chancellor has not given any reason why it's less.
No.
Certainly some people will read this, and I think that, they're not necessarily wrong to read it this way. It does seem to be that when it was the whole country, then it has to be quite high. But when it's a Tory government which only needs to impose it on Northerners, it doesn't need to be so high because they don't really care.
No, exactly. I mean, they only have about a third of the seats in Greater Manchester anyway,
Right,
and
yeah.
Frankly, if they lost them, they'd still have a majority, so they don't particularly care. I mean, it should be said that Rishi Sunak has eventually been forced to slightly increase it. You now get a little more than you did before, and also, crucially, your employer doesn't have to pay so much of it. So, previously, you had to work at least a third of your hours. Your employer was paying another third on top, and then the government. Whereas now, the amount of it's slightly more generous overall, and the amount of money that both you and your employer proportionally is less, and the government's contributing more. So he has been forced to walk back his originally quite stringent policies a bit, mainly just due to opposition from certain people within the cabinet itself. I mean, there's been a big fight really the whole time throughout this sort of pandemic between the kind of more Johnsonian type Conservatives who are happy with a bit more state intervention and state spending in certain cases, on the one hand, and mainly Rishi Sunak on the other, who is very much more in the kind of George Osborne austerity mould.
What it reminds me of a little bit is that I seem to remember that this was part of why Rishi Sunak is Chancellor now, is because Sajid Javid was even more so in that camp.
Yeah.
He's a read Ayn Rand to your children kind of Conservative. Yeah.
Oh god, that's horrifying.
I think I'm not making that up. I think I might be misremembering it, but I'm pretty sure that's true.
What, that he reads Ayn Rand to his children?
Or maybe to his wife. I can't remember it properly, but there's something about Rishi's Sajid Javid and Ayn Rand.
Horrifying. Why does anyone like Ayn Rand? The books are 1,000 pages long or something. They're mostly like there's one speech in Atlas Shrugged that goes on for 40 pages or something. Mm-hmm. The woman can't write.
Yeah.
Even if her ideas weren't balmy, the fact remains that she can't write.
Yeah. They are by right-wing standards as well. They're not terribly philosophically.
No. I mean, what kind of how bloody arrogant do you have to be to come up with a philosophy and call it objectivism?
Yeah.
You might as well just call it rightism or correctism.
Yeah. I'm right by definition because I say so.
Oh, yeah. It's absurd.
Yeah. It's a weird sort of philosophical move that people make sometimes, because it purports to start from objective bases and then derive everything through logic. It says, okay, so the human being exists, it has a relationship to the world, blah, 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 therefore free market economics. It's sort of... It's denying that there is even such a thing as the possibility of things being politically contentious, or there being such a thing as a legitimate debate. It's a really... silly. That's a foul move when it comes to proper inquiry, trying to say that people aren't even allowed to disagree with you.
I mean, it is a move that a lot of ideologies try and make. There's a concept which comes from, in at least large part, from a philosopher called Michael Friedan, which is that ideologies are, in essence, or at least can be viewed as competitions for the control of language. And I think in particular, so you have sort of like liberalism, libertarianism, socialism, conservatism will all sort of squabble over the meaning of freedom, for example. So
totally, yeah.
Libertarians want to try and define it as like absolute property rights and nothing else, and progressive liberals will say more, oh no, it's about maximizing opportunities for development, and then an anarchist might say it's about non-domination and the ability of the human being to flourish without sort of constraint from like hierarchies of power.
Yeah, totally. But I think the thing with Ayn Rand is that she takes that she goes one step further back with it, I suppose. She says humans are beings in the objective world with a subjective experience of their own consciousness. Therefore, freedom must mean this.
Yeah.
So she doesn't just contend over the meaning of words that are involved in political discussions. She starts to say that there is only one political consequence, the only view of the human being that you could reasonably have. It's not recognising that human nature is something which is also political. People disagree about what it is to be human as well.
And human nature is extremely malleable.
Yeah, well, totally.
Many of the things that we think are human nature now were certainly not human nature 200 years ago, because ideological concepts like liberalism have changed the way humans think.
There's an analogy that I came across recently about what Marx thought about human nature, which is that his basic position is that human nature does very much exist, but it's always conditioned by the circumstances that the humans are in. So humans have a fundamental nature, but it's also, there's no such thing as a human who is only their fundamental nature. They always have. Human nature is meaningless unless it's in a particular manifestation of it. So hunger is a human thing, but hunger is very different depending on the social conditions that you're in. So the hunger of humans before and after we invented cooking is different, because we have the notion of hunger but you want some cheese only makes sense in a society where cheese exists.
Can you imagine living in a society where cheese didn't exist?
I know.
I mean, that is like the majority of human societies on Earth now, right? Like
milk gone off.
But yeah, most people in Eastern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America don't eat cheese.
Oh, cheese is weird, but it's just really good as well.
What are they missing? I'd like to report that all of my friends I know who are lactose intolerant, including at least one who is Chinese, resolutely refuse to accept this fact and eat cheese and yogurts and things anyway, because it's good.
Yeah. It's a repeated thing that when if you speak to vegans, that giving up dairy, particularly cheese, is much worse than giving up meat.
Yeah, I can believe that. I live in a house full of vegetarians and vegans. Actually, no, I don't think anyone's vegan at the moment. I think those who were vegans gave it up for lockdown because they were finding it very difficult to get a lot of the food that they would normally substitute for eggs.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And therefore were struggling to get protein. But yeah, I find myself surrounded by vegetable consume, and it's just me like just butchering out some chicken. Like, hey, it's okay because one of my housemates has a dog, and I sometimes share my chicken with her, and then I feel better.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, back to coronavirus. So. You come for the tangents, you know you do. The only reason anyone ever listens to this is for the tangents.
Yeah.
You could get the rest of it anywhere else. No, I shouldn't say that. You couldn't get the rest of it anywhere else. We are unique and special. If you don't, I'll cry. But yeah, so something I wanted to bring up, which I found very interesting, is this sort of formation of this new bloc within the Conservative Party, who have sort of dubbed themselves the Northern Research Group.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard of this. So.
Yeah, so this is obviously sort of modelled after the European Research Group, the group of extremely hardline Eurosceptics who ultimately sort of rejected Theresa May's deal, basically cost her prime ministership, and have all the way through the Brexit process finagling things to try and get the hardest line Brexit they possibly can. So the Northern Research Group have modelled themselves on this, and they consist of 55 members of Parliament from the Conservative Party representing seats in the North and Midlands. There are 41 out in the open, and there are 14 who remain anonymous, and to quote The Guardian, are thought to include serving members of the government.
Ooh, blimey.
Ooh, spooky. It's Halloween.
Yeah.
So yeah, they wrote a letter to the government, and specifically to the Prime Minister the other day, basically demanding what they call a clear roadmap out of lockdown. So basically their argument runs roughly thus, that mostly so far the local lockdowns have been in the North and Midlands, and that not having any clear sort of criteria for when these local lockdowns will be ended puts people and puts businesses, of course they're the Tories, they're very concerned about businesses, in the north of England in a very, very difficult position, because they are sort of unable to plan for the future. They don't know what's going to be happening because there's no criteria by which they can look at the data and say, okay, cases are coming down this much, so we'll probably be able to reopen in a week or a month or 2 months. Because no criteria have been laid out, they aren't able to do that. They're also asking for this sort of levelling up agenda that Boris Johnson was talking about a lot before the pandemic bit. And they're basically saying that so far we haven't really seen any of this, and in particular the North and the Midlands deserve a substantial share of the whatever new funding is going to be available, because they've had to suffer sort of disproportionately so far from the coronavirus pandemic. And You know what? I don't think any of that is unreasonable.
No, it's all perfectly.
But yeah, I mean, so this is a lot of the people who are in the what were called. There's this weird thing about the Red Wall. You know the Red Wall seats. 2019, and Labour lost the Red Wall seats. Had you ever heard the term Red Wall before the 2019 general election? Nope. Completely made up out of nowhere. Completely made up. But anyway, and there's a lot of the Tory MPs who were in those previous Red Wall, in scare quotes, seats.
Come to think of it, I seem to remember that in the 2016 American election, people did use the phrase blue wall to refer to states like Wisconsin and Michigan.
Yeah. Which
all went to Trump, so I think it might be a sort of
a borrowing.
A reference
no,
to
I
that.
think you're probably... Oh, I should say there is one of the MPs in question. It's actually in Scotland.
Scotland is north of England.
Yeah, and it's a seat. It's a seat in the Scottish Borders area,
right,
in the south of Scotland, which has a very kind of English-oriented sort of politics.
Well, over the many centuries, the English-Scottish border has moved a lot. So people that are near the border on both sides are kind of a mixed influences historically.
Yes. I mean, you only have to look at Berwick.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I mean, didn't that change hands 14 times or something?
Technically in England, but they still play in the Scottish League.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Beautiful Berwick. Yeah. Berwick upon Tweed this is. Go if you can. But not right now, because there's a lockdown on.
This episode is sponsored by the Berwick Tourism Board.
We should be. No adverts.
Maybe they'll send us a lot of, because we've mentioned it on air, they'll send us a big load of tweed or something.
Yeah. This is a I don't think it works like that. This is a Creative Commons attribution share alike licensed podcast. You, the people, can do whatever you fucking want.
Yeah.
With this podcast, including edit out me saying the word fucking.
If you want.
Which I might do myself.
Yeah. Only one of them.
Again, I might not. Sorry?
Only one of them.
Yeah, only one of them. Yeah. And we do not run ads on this podcast. Because if we did so, we would be massive hypocrites. Mm-hmm. But I did make a Patreon ages ago that I've never actually used, but I might stick that up. And you can give us money if you want, because we're poor.
We're just talking about how much we like Berwick out of the goodness of our hearts.
Yeah. And there is very much goodness in our hearts. Particularly for Berwick. Yeah, anyway, I thought this sort of Northern Research Group manifestation is interesting. Because they seem to be directing a lot of their ire very specifically at Rishi Sunak. And Andy Burnham, as well, was quoted the other week as saying, the problem now is, to a large degree, the Chancellor. And I think this is... Rishi Sunak, throughout most of this period, has been getting quite a lot of plaudits for the way he's handled things. But I think that is slowly starting to change now.
So it does seem to be a thing that, over the last year or so, the Tories have been doing various things that make it look like they're kind of grooming Rishi Sunak, the future leader.
Mm-hmm.
And just recently, in a few different ways, it's sort of fallen apart a bit, and he's got some very seriously bad press. For example, over this, but also over the meal deals thing turning out to have been demonstrably had an impact on spreading coronavirus. It's really enormous, actually, way bigger, of course, than I thought. I can't remember the numbers on it, but I read the research and it's quite serious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he has gone from the sort of golden boy to, I think, his position is now somewhat precarious. And people have... I mean, at the start of the pandemic, I think most people were sort of blaming Boris Johnson for everything that went wrong. And ultimately, he is the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. You know, he is ultimately responsible for the decisions made by the government. So that is correct in a certain sense. But I think people are now starting to realise that actually a large part of the fact that the pandemic response has been bungled is because you've got this tug of war in the cabinet between Rishi Sunak and Matt Hancock, the health secretary. And Boris Johnson is flitting from one to the other, trying to balance things, but being very indecisive as he generally is and not doing very well. And that it's Sunak's position, essentially, that we are going to have to live with the coronavirus for a long time. Lockdowns aren't going to be very helpful in the long term. And so essentially what we should do is we should take care, first and foremost, of the economy. And by the economy, he, of course, doesn't mean people, because that would be ridiculous, right? Why would the people of the country matter at all to the economy? No, he means businesses and growth rates.
Yeah, there are ways that you could try to help the economy, which would be much more helpful than what he's doing.
Of course, yeah. I mean, basically he is blinded by his sort of neoliberal blinkers from realizing that you can't fundamentally have a flourishing economy if people are dying and are terrified of dying.
Yeah.
it just can't be done, because the economy isn't some kind of abstract, reified thing that exists out in the ether. It is a emergent phenomenon of human interactions. But of course, if one accepted that, one would be a socialist.
Yeah.
So he can't. Yeah, it's really terrible. I mean, it's essentially, as I said on the lost episode, it's the same recycled ideas that George Osborne had in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and the argument was bogus then, and it is, if anything, even more bogus now.
Yeah, I think more obviously bogus as well.
Quite. I think people are starting to wake up and realise it. Hashtag wake up sheeple.
Like, a huge part of how austerity was justified to the public was throughout all kinds of demonising poor and working class people.
And immigrants, of course.
The first sort of sharp edge of that stuff, which we've seen recently, is the has gone with the free school. And there's been a huge amount of propaganda pumped out saying things like, just being anti-single parents, and if you're too poor, you shouldn't have children, or all that kind of stuff. And it seems to have not really landed very well. Certainly not as well as housing benefits claimants was in 2012.
No. Yeah, absolutely. People of, Marcus Rashford's campaigns to alleviate food poverty over the summer holidays, and again now over half term, and presumably it's going to come up again at Christmas. And universal credit, is in a terrible state, as it has been since it was introduced, but now it's starting to show through to more people because more people are having to rely on it. I mean,
I suppose it's harder to demonise people when those very things are so much more widespread. It
makes it much more difficult.
Yeah,
because most people now are in a position where if they aren't facing these kinds of hardships themselves, they probably at least know someone who is,
and they know that it wouldn't take much to put them in that position as well.
Yeah, and it's much like with immigration, where it's the areas where non-immigrants and immigrants sort of mix more freely are the areas where attitudes to immigration are far more positive, because once you know people who are in that situation, it's much more difficult for the right-wing press to demonize them, because you can say, but my friend down the road who is a member of category X that you're trying to demonize.
Yeah. The fact that you've got so much more in common with them than you do with the government who's trying to cut your public services is really obvious if you know them personally.
Yeah, whereas it's equally true if you don't, but much less obvious to most people. Understandably so, because people, people are living in a situation where much of the media is constantly trying to pretend and to convince people that their interests are in conflict with immigrants or benefit claimants or black people or whoever it happens to be that week. And it isn't surprising, and to an extent it isn't necessarily people's fault if they're in a situation where it's easier for them to be convinced of that. But it's gonna be a nasty winter. I mean, a personal message: I got COVID at the end of May. I first noticed symptoms on, I think, the 30th. And I ended up having the sort of acute phase of the virus with the loss of taste, the coughing, the fever, things like that. That lasted about 5 weeks until that had mostly died down. And then even now, 5 months later, I still get chest pains. I still get tightness of breath if I try and do any physical exercise. I cannot do a fifth of what I could do physically at the beginning of this year. It is really serious, even if you are young. I'm 24. Even if you are otherwise in reasonably good health. If you catch this, not everyone, but a substantial percentage of people are going to have serious long-term side effects. And I really, really urge everyone listening to this, please do everything you can to stay safe and keep your loved ones safe, because, this is horrible. I've had it. I've seen my partner have it, and sometimes you're just in so much pain. It brings me to tears just thinking about it. So please be safe. Please be safe.
Amen.
What? Oh, it's time for you to get. It's time for you to get nice. So, on our lost episode, we talked for a fair while about Keir Starmer and his leadership of the Labour Party, and I would say that, on balance, David's opinion was more favourable toward Keir Starmer than mine was.
Yeah, I had a strong contingent of I wanted to give him a fair shot.
Yeah, which is an understandable concern. I certainly was of that sort of mindset at the beginning of his leadership. I think I became disillusioned with him sort of over the Long Bailey sacking. I think that was the moment where I was like, this is very clearly a vindictive move against someone on the left of the party over a completely fabricated charge. I mean, she was sacked from her position as Shadow Education Secretary for sharing on Twitter an article from The Independent where the actress Maxine Peake had been interviewed, during which she had made an offhand comment about Israeli and American police sort of co-training exercises, where she slightly incorrectly attributed a particular tactic to having been taught the Americans by the Israelis, which turned out not to be
those
the
joint
case.
training things and the sharing of techniques definitely do happen.
Yes.
No one's denying that. It's just that there is no explicit evidence that that particular technique was taught to the Americans by the Israelis. And also, that wasn't what Rebecca Long-Bailey was referencing. She was sharing the article for a different reason. It was a long interview, and then they talked on several topics. It's just that this was also mentioned in a different part of the interview, which was published in an article in the Independent, which they tweeted, and then Rebecca Long-Bailey retweeted.
Yeah.
And that apparently means that you can't have a future at the top of British politics. Is that the standard that we're setting now? Ridiculous. Yeah. I think it was on the same day, or at least it was a similar time, that Rachel Reeves tweeted out a very sort of glowing, saying lots of nice things about an actual Nazi, and yet she's still a senior member of the Shadow Cabinet.
But she's a Blairite, so that's allowed.
That's the thing, right? So this is pointing out that it is factional is not itself factional. It's just the truth.
Yes. And I mean, it was framed at the time. Keir Starmer sort of said, well, I asked her to remove the particular tweet, and she refused, so I had no choice. And, I mean, why should someone take down a social media post that they made completely in good faith, which isn't in and of itself at all offensive to anybody looking at it with any degree of objectivity? And then, of course, it turned out after the fact that in the run-up to this incident, Rebecca Long-Bailey had been disagreeing with Keir Starmer and with other members of the Shadow Cabinet about whether to support the government's plans to reopen schools. And so it turned out, actually, it was not only factional, but it was about, it seems at least to have been, in large part, about a specific policy of theirs that she didn't like, and therefore, she was out.
Yeah.
And this was just the excuse.
And as I say, I was willing to look past that.
But more well, let's just say events have transpired in the last few days, which have rendered David's opinion
somewhat
slightly
changed,
less
somewhat altered.
favourable.
Yeah.
David, would you like to explain why you've changed your mind a little on this issue?
Okay.
To the good people of the audience.
So let's just stop dancing around it and say that the thing is that the former immediate predecessor as leader of the Labour Party from Keir Starmer, Jeremy Corbyn, has been suspended from the party. Keir Starmer claims it wasn't his decision, although it obviously was.
Mm-hmm.
But, he's both a liar and a coward, so he's pretending that it's not his decision. But anyway, so the context of this is that the Equalities and Human Rights, is it Commission or Council? Commission, yeah. Has been investigating the Labour Party over the problem of there being anti-Semitism in the party. And actually, quite specifically, the report is about whether anything which violates the Equalities Act was done by employees of the party.
Acting in their position as
capacity,
agents of the party, yeah.
And this has been a contentious issue for a long time, right? And this, I was hoping to be, what I was expecting to be talking about this, would be the moment to start trying to talk sensibly about this issue, to remove it from the factionalism which has made it so difficult to talk about until now. Keir Starmer has made the decision that rather than taking that opportunity, he's going to massively ramp up the extent to which this is riven with factional.
And when asked about this, I think yesterday, he said, I don't want a civil war.
Yeah, right.
Well then, Keir, you shouldn't have fired the starting gun on one.
Yeah.
You can't claim you don't want to cause a civil war in the party at the same time as shooting in the back one of the most beloved and important and prominent members on the left of the party for the last 50 years.
Makes you wonder if when Charles I raised his standard in Nottingham, I think it was in Nottingham, and declared war on Parliament, if he then said, "I hope this doesn't lead to a civil war."
I don't know if he said something. I don't know if he said exactly those words, but having studied the English Civil War a little bit in the past, I can absolutely guarantee you he would have said something rather similar. So, because he was just that type.
Yeah. So the thing is, the report did not recommend. It actually didn't particularly call out Jeremy Corbyn personally at all. It's actually
I'm not sure if he's even named.
No, I think it's a fairly well balanced report. But Jeremy Corbyn has been suspended for... Well, the thing is, they haven't actually said what he's been suspended for, because he hasn't broken any rules, so they can't. But...
No.
What everyone's reporting it as, and what it's quite clearly is proximally caused by, was his response to the publishing of the report, in which he basically, very graciously and balanced way, said... this is an incredibly important issue. I hope that all of the recommendations of this report are implemented as quickly as possible, and I recognise that my leadership made mistakes and move on and do better on this issue. But he also made the factually true comment that there has been a false impression of what the scale of anti-Semitism complaints towards people in the Labour Party is in the way that this has been reported.
Yeah.
And we are making the assumption that that is what he's been suspended. Now,
because prior to Jeremy Corbyn making his statement, Keir Starmer said something along the lines of, anyone making out that this is, purely a factional thing shouldn't be in the Labour Party.
Which he didn't
Which,
say.
to be clear, Jeremy Corbyn very much did not do.
Yes. He said that it's been... Oh, there is also the fact that the media have reported this as if Jeremy Corbyn said that the EHRC report is exaggerating anti-Semitism.
Exactly.
Which is not true. That's not what he said. And it kind of proves his point. That saying that is exaggerating. It proves his point. The fact that he says that the report is exaggerating when he didn't say that is proof that the media have been exaggerating. They've been doing that. Media misreporting of pretty much everything Jeremy Corbyn says and does on this issue has been endemic, and it's been happening on these issues, and that proves his point. That is not the same thing as saying anti-Semitism in the Labour Party doesn't exist, it's been made up for factional, which is not what he said, because that's not true.
No, of course not. I mean, there are undoubtedly, certainly, anti-Semites in the Labour Party.
Yeah.
There are anti-Semites in all walks of life in the United Kingdom, but particularly in certain sections of the left. There has been a tendency to equate certain sort of certain actions of the Israeli government or certain actions by sort of international finance capital, for example, with some kind of specifically Jewish influence.
There are particular ways that anti-Semitism manifests on the left that are specific to the left. Absolutely.
There's a brilliant article about this that I read a little while ago that I shall link in the show notes because everyone should read it, written by a Jewish socialist. But yeah, I mean, it's been called the socialism of fools before anti-Semitism, and there are undoubtedly anti-Semites on the left. There always have been. I very much hope one day there won't be, but I think that day is probably quite far off in the future.
Oh, and just to make it absolutely clear, Jeremy Corbyn is not party to it at all.
No. Jeremy Corbyn is not an anti-Semite. Anyone claiming that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite doesn't understand a thing about what anti-Semitism is or who Jeremy Corbyn is. The only thing that Jeremy Corbyn has done during his entire career that I can work out that could justifiably be called into question was in 2012 when he called in the comments of a post in a private Facebook group that a particular mural that was painted by a graffiti artist in his patch in London shouldn't have been erased by the anti-graffiti squad because he considered it, essentially the graffiti art shouldn't be treated in that way.
Yeah.
That particular mural, it turned out, featured some anti-Semitic tropes, which it indisputably did. But Jeremy Corbyn pointed out that that wasn't the basis for his objection, and also that he basically hadn't paid that much attention to it, and he regretted that fact.
Yes, and as soon as he realised that the reason why it had been taken down is because people had complained about it on the grounds that it is anti-Semitic, he immediately said, "Oh, I didn't realise that was the problem. Therefore, it should have been taken down."
Quite. And, yeah, indisputably that was a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't belie some kind of fundamental hatred in his heart.
But if you made a small factual error 8 years ago, which you immediately corrected, that doesn't mean that you in a two-party political system, you should be banned from participating in either of the two main parties. If that is the standard, then we're not a free society. We're not a democracy.
No.
Right?
No, absolutely. It's completely ridiculous.
So, the EHRC report basically calls out the Labour Party for three specific things. For the fact that its training on anti-Semitism wasn't up to standard, which is true, it's quite right. That there were political interventions in the disciplinary process, so the disciplinary process wasn't fully independent, and what's the other one? Harassment, which has quite a specific legal definition in this context.
Yes.
Now,
and I should point out there are only two unambiguous cases of harassment that were substantiated by the EHRC.
Both of whom were then kicked out of the party under Jeremy Corbyn. Right? Now, another problem with the way that this story has been reported recently is that when people have been saying political interventions in the disciplinary process, that has been framed as if that's Corbyn intervening to make the disciplinary process easier on people who are accused of anti-Semitism. That is not true. Right? Many of these interventions, most of them in fact, have been the leadership office intervening in a bureaucratic disciplinary process, which everyone, including the EHRC, recognise was inadequate in order to speed up people being kicked out of the party. Now, that doesn't mean that was right, but it does mean that it is misleading to report it as if these interventions were Corbyn trying to be soft on anti-Semites. It's that his leadership didn't always follow proper procedure in their attempts to expedite the process of kicking people out of the party for anti-Semitism.
It should also be noted that there is a wider practice within the Labour Party of the leadership office intervening in internal party disputes and disciplinary cases that are deemed politically sensitive,
yes.
Which the anti-Semitism allegations to the Labour Party during this period undisputably were. They were sort of being... They were getting so much press in the media that the leadership office felt it necessary to intervene in these, along with other disputes and cases that didn't have anything to do with anti-Semitism, in order to make sure they were dealt with properly.
Yeah, and the supreme irony of this is that that's exactly what Keir Starmer's just done. Is politically intervene in the disciplinary process to kick Jeremy Corbyn out.
Yeah, frankly, it is. Yeah. It also, a lot of the reporting around this has also ignored the previous report, the sort of the initial internal report conducted by the Labour Party into these allegations.
Which was to be submitted to the EHRC.
Yes, which was leaked, back at the beginning of this year, not long after Keir Starmer taken over, or possibly even before he'd taken over, or around the same time. Anyway, in which that report made it very clear that various members, officials within the Labour Party machinery from the right of the party had repeatedly sabotaged the efforts of the leadership and of the disciplinary procedure to deal with anti-Semitism cases in order to make Jeremy Corbyn look bad because they didn't want him.
Yes, and this goes back to a point about Keir Starmer that he's often talking about how So he's framing anyone who mentions the factional element of this as if they are dismissing any claims that there's anti-Semitism in the Labour Party as a factional attack. And that's not what people are saying. The way to get rid of the factionalism, which is endemic in the Labour Party and has therefore had an effect on the way that this issue has been dealt with, and obviously on any attempt to reform the internal bureaucracy of the party to make it more capable of dealing with violations of its internal rules, will be affected by the fact that different branches of the party are recognising that there is factionalism is not itself an attempt to make there be more factionalism. The only way to get rid of the factionalism is not to deny that there ever was any, or that it had any effect.
That makes it impossible to ever.
Yeah.
And Keir Starmer ran for election to the leadership on a platform of uniting the party.
Yeah, right.
And what he has now done...
Which was obviously completely, not true. That wasn't his agenda.
No, well, I mean, this gives the lie to that
Yeah.
in the most spectacular and clear-cut way possible. If your objective was to unite the Labour Party, to sort of bring down the level of factionalism within the Labour Party, the last thing you would do would be to suspend the previous leader of the Labour Party from a different part of the party to you.
In another country. If MAS in Bolivia, for example, they'd come to power, they'd had a new leader, and then within a few months of them becoming leader, immediately what they did was sack their main primary opponent for obviously political reasons, in order to marginalise them within the party so that they're not a threat, and then immediately sack the previous leader of the party on obviously trumped-up charges. Will we be saying, oh, well, this is obviously just perfect, this is just due process, this is just them following the internal party rules? No, it's obvious. It's obviously politically motivated, it's a coup, it's, Yeah. Right, so what Jeremy Corbyn has said in his response to the EHRC report didn't violate any Labour Party rules or the law. What he did do was defend himself in very reasonable terms, whilst also acknowledging the ways in which his leadership did not deal with the problem properly and the ways in which it needs to change. That is a person's right under due process to defend themselves, right? And to say things which are true under the Human Rights Act. And yet Keir Starmer apparently doesn't care about that either. So if someone is willing to deceive the people who they're trying to sell themselves to as an electorate by claiming that their agenda is something other than it is, and then immediately flip as soon as they're elected, and they don't believe in due process and people's rights under the Human Rights Act, are they fit to... Certainly, are they fit to run the Labour Party? Are they fit to run anything? Are they fit to run the levers of the British state? I don't know. There's got to be a question whether that kind of person... Whether a decent, right-thinking person can have it on their conscience to try and make that.
No,
compare that to what I was saying
agree.
a few days ago when I was being.
Yeah, your audio from last week is perfectly fine. So I'll put a little clip of what you said last week.
Okay, it's pretty broad. If I can just talk about him for a bit, what's my take? So, in many ways, it's too soon to say, really. Like the French Revolution, yeah. But, so for a start, I didn't vote for him. I voted for Rebecca Long-Bailey, because I thought she'd be a better leader. But I'm not... So, if there was an election tomorrow, I would definitely be voting Labour. Which I would... He's only the second Labour leader I would have done that for. I didn't vote for Ed Miliband, for example. Because Labour Party policy is very different now than it was under Ed Miliband. Because policy is not all set by the leader's office. It's set by conference and then written in a complex compositing process by many different branches of the party. And conference hasn't really changed the policy direction very much yet. And Keir Starmer was elected on 10 pledges, which on policy sound pretty good. If he sticks to them, I'll be very happy with him being Prime Minister. The question is, will he stick to them? And will he use the power and influence of the leader's office in the very complex policy-forming process of the Labour Party, and the influence of the leader's office is considerable, to do everything that he can to jettison all of the radical policy? Or to what extent will he do that? It's hard to say. There have been some quite bad signs over the first part of his leadership. But also... So if you compare him to some previous Labour leaders that he has been compared to quite a lot, for example, Neil Kinnock, he is currently governing in a much less hostile way to the left of the party than Neil Kinnock did, for example. Yeah. I think probably Keir Starmer is it's actually quite an unusual position for someone to be in. We haven't had them very often. But I think he's basically an authentic centre-left kind of a person. He's not a radical left person, but he's not... What people call centre-left is usually actually centrist or centre-right in practice. I think he's more of a sort of... He's got some left-wing instincts and some centrist instincts and he does everything that he can to try and do both all the time. I think that's my broad take on Keir Starmer. I mean, I must say, I'm holding fire on this to a certain extent, because Jeremy Corbyn has not been expelled from the Labour Party. He's been suspended pending an investigation. So if that process is allowed to actually play out fairly, and he is reinstated because he hasn't done anything wrong, then we can call this a bad week and then move on, and it's okay, I think. But the leadership have a choice to make. Do they really want to destroy the party over nothing, or do they want to try and get into government? Because the party won't win if it's split like this. Divided parties like this do not win power. One way of putting it, someone said that I think gets to the heart of this, is, does Keir Starmer want to be Neil Kinnock, or does he want to be Harold Wilson? Because what Harold Wilson didn't do is attack the left of the party. He didn't say, you can trust me because I'm stomping on the left. He said, we're going to try to come up with a policy platform which is a compromise between all parts of the party, and then try and get elected as a unified party. And he won 4 general elections and changed Britain for the better, whereas Neil Kinnock did the reverse. He attacked the left, tried to purge it from the party, and lost 2 general elections, never became Prime Minister, destroyed the party for a generation, and then paved the way for someone much further to his right to come after him. Which one of those does Keir Starmer want to be? That's the choice he's got.
I don't even... I mean, your point is extremely eloquently put, but I don't even think he has to make that choice. All he has to do is follow the recommendations of the EHRC report, not directly intervene in the disciplinary process, which is now about to unfold with regard to Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, he's already interfered once, so the likelihood is he will try to interfere again. Yeah. There's certainly no reason to believe he won't. I hope he's sensible and doesn't, but because, frankly, I would like the Labour Party to win the next general election, because no one better has a cat and hell's chance of doing so, and I want Boris Johnson's shower out.
Yeah. I mean, if the legal case here, Jeremy Corbyn has a very strong case. Because he hasn't done anything wrong. He hasn't broken any rules. That's it. So if due process is followed, he very likely will be reinstated. But it's just very unlikely for due process to be followed.
And the problem is that the Labour Party leadership has a carte blanche excuse when it comes to suspensions and expulsions from the party, which is bringing the party into disrepute.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
They can define that almost any way they want.
Yeah.
Which is bad and should be gotten rid of, in my view.
Yes. How about launching an illegal war in the Middle East?
Oh, I wasn't going to bring that up, but if you insist.
I'm just going to say why I bring it up. It's because there's something people have been saying which really annoys me, which is that this is the darkest day in Labour Party history.
Yes. Oh my God.
For God's sake. What about when ATMIC bombed people in Malaysia with napalm?
Yeah.
What about when 500,000 people, possibly as many as 1 million people, depending on how you calculate it, innocent people have been killed in the Middle East because of Tony Blair? Tell you what's happened about. What about during the referendum campaign in 2016, when a fascist stabbed a Labour Party to death in the street and then screamed, "Death to traitors, Britain first"? Right? I tell you, this is not underplaying the seriousness of anti-Semitism or the fact that it exists in the Labour Party and that more has to be done about it. But throughout this whole process of Labour anti-Semitism and whether the leadership dealt with it properly or not, no one died, right? And if that doesn't demonstrate that people have been exaggerating this issue, I don't know what will.
Yeah. I don't really know how to follow that. I was going to rant about Tony Blair for a minute because you'd brought him up and I was trying not to, and I hate him so fucking much.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, you're quite right. And the Labour Party consistently has been the major organ of the British state that has defended the rights of Jewish people in this country. Like, Labour Party members marched at the Battle of Cable Street against Mosley's black shirts to see off the threat of fascism in the 1930s. Jeremy Corbyn himself has been a consistent campaigner against anti-Semitism, throughout his entire life. This is a ridiculous campaign by certain right-wing elements of the Labour Party in order to make sure that the left are crushed out of existence as a meaningful faction within the Labour Party. Of course there are anti-Semites in the Labour Party, and they should unquestionably be expunged from it. I do not want a single anti-Semite masquerading as a leftist anywhere on earth. All right? Anyone who holds anti-Jewish prejudices and beliefs should be found out, should be if they can, made to see the error of their ways, and if they refuse to see the error of their ways, they should be absolutely kicked out of any organisation that has even a merest claim to call itself left-wing. You know, that is unquestionable and undeniable. And I agree with Jeremy Corbyn that the EHRC report's recommendations should be swiftly implemented.
Yeah, me too.
I've been reading the report today, and they seem
it's quite good.
remarkably even-handed and fair.
It's one of the major achievements of the Blair government is the existence of the EHRC. I like that we live in a country where there is an organisation like this that can come into non-state bureaucracies like political parties or corporations and vet them for discrimination and racism, and has legal power. That's good.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And again, but as the EHRC itself says, one of the most important things that needs to be done is that this stuff has to be taken out of the hands of the leadership altogether. And yes, Jeremy Corbyn is somewhat at fault for not having done that. So is every other leader of the Labour Party since this disciplinary process was at first implemented. And, you know, Jeremy Corbyn doesn't deserve more blame, or less blame than any of the others. But Keir Starmer, by intervening in the case of Jeremy Corbyn to suspend him from the Labour Party, has completely blown out of the water any credibility he has to turn around and say that Jeremy Corbyn did anything particularly wrong.
Imagine the conversation we could be having today after the EHRC report has been published about how the Labour Party needs to do better, about trying to remove this debate from the toxic factionalism which has stopped any part of the Labour Party from being able to get a handle on this properly. About being honest about the flaws in the way that Corbyn approached it. We could be having that conversation today. Keir Starmer has decided that dealing with that, taking this out of factionalism, actually starting to talk seriously about anti-Semitism, the Labour Party starting to actually, seriously start to get on top of this and fulfil its duty to Jewish people, which is to sort this issue out, because it's really not, the Labour Party has not been good on this. I'm going to say that. We could be having that conversation, but Keir Starmer thinks it's more important to launch a factional attack on the left than to actually take this opportunity to start properly dealing with this issue. It's low. It's very, very low from the leadership.
And from a man who in his former career was a human rights lawyer, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
It is quite disgusting, frankly. And I am going to, as the trans representative on the podcast, make the point that over the past several weeks, there have been numerous cases in which members of the Labour Party, including a sitting MP, Rosie Duffield, the MP for Cambridge, have made extremely transphobic comments, both on social media and in interviews. And Keir Starmer has both sides of the issue, to the back teeth. Jess Phillips, it has been making these kinds of transphobic comments for years. She reads out a list of women who are the victims of domestic abuse in Parliament. Every year, and deliberately leaves off trans women, who particularly black trans women and other trans women of colour are murdered at a much higher rate than anyone else on Earth. It is a massive double standard.
Yeah.
A massive double standard. And why? Because the anti-Semitism stuff is good mileage from a factional perspective, whereas the trans issues aren't. Because if he comes down on the side of trans women, he will be made out by the right and by factions within the British media influenced by trans-exclusive feminists, so-called feminists, to be some kind of...
Not to say that one of them is more important than the other. It's exactly the point that one of them isn't more important than the other, which is why they should both be taken seriously.
They should both be taken equally seriously, and both and so should all forms of discrimination. And I agree that the EHRC report says that response to sexual harassment complaints and to complaints for other forms of racism, for example, have much clearer guidance and were dealt with much more swiftly than, in many cases, than anti-Semitism complaints. And I absolutely will insist that is corrected. Although I will point out that, as I said earlier, according to the previous internal Labour Party report, a lot of those delays were caused by right-wing Labour officials trying to make Corbyn look bad. But even so, they should never have been in a position in the first place where they were able to do that, because the complaints procedure should have been entirely independent from the word go. Yes. And that needs to happen. And it needs to happen for all forms of disciplinary complaints.
Which it is significantly more so because of the reforms that Jeremy Corbyn brought in. Needs to go further, but there's a strong argument for making that Jeremy Corbyn is the first Labour leader for a while to actually make Labour's internal disciplinary process better, more fit for purpose, more capable of getting rid of anti-Semitism. not good enough, and it took them too long to make those reforms happen. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be allowed to be in politics. That's not a free society.
And if that is going to be the standard, then Keir Starmer should resign tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
Because, as I said, he has completely failed to deal with the epidemic of transphobia among, and specifically, I should say, transmisogyny among several members, including an MP within the Labour Party. So if that's the standard, Keir Starmer should resign tomorrow. As an MP, let alone leader of the Labour.
Or rather, the Governance and Legal Unit should suspend him from the party.
Yeah, absolutely.
But why won't they? Factional reasons. And saying that it's factional is true, and even if it's not true, it's a legitimate opinion. People shouldn't be kicked out of the party for saying so. That is a free society. And if Keir Starmer doesn't believe in a free society, then he shouldn't be Prime Minister. And it's up to him to prove that he does.
Because he's lost his right to the benefit of the doubt now.
Yep. Yeah, that's the bottom line, I suppose, is that I've run out of benefit of the doubt when it comes to Keir Starmer. He's a person who is hostile to much of what I believe, and that's just a fact. Got to start recognising it.
And he ran on a platform of essentially policy continuity with Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. And policy continuity with Jeremy Corbyn and taking the party leadership out of factionalism, i.e. not attacking the left.
The fact that he has broken his promise on one of those so extravagantly means I cannot, and the left I don't think can, have any confidence he means the other.
Especially after immediately after he became party leader, he went on the TV news and said that he hated the process of selling himself to the membership. Right?
And it's important, I think, I talked about this last week, so I'm resurrecting this from the grave for all you listeners, but it's important, I think, to understand the factional nature of Keir Starmer's own personal coalition. Keir Starmer is a member of the Tribune group of MPs on what is broadly considered the soft left. These are the group from which the Socialist Campaign Group split in the early 1980s and became the hard left. Starmer is on the soft left.
Yeah. Broadly, historically, that comes from when the party started to shift right in the 80s. The Tribune group used to be the broad left of the party, and as the party moved right, the split was broadly. One reading of it is that the Socialist Campaign Group was the bit of the left that wanted to resist that shift, and the Tribune group was the bit that wanted to go along with it, but still be the left side,
or at the very least,
right
sort of
party.
accommodate itself.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so you have the split emerges with Tony Benn leading the Socialist Campaign Group, and then people like Michael Foot and then later Neil Kinnock coming to lead the sort of Tribune group, the soft left group of MPs, right? Starmer is part of that soft left formation, and it's incorrect. Some people occasionally do to label him a Blairite or anything of the sort. But the character of his coalition of power within the Parliamentary Labour Party is very different, because he got the nominations in the first round of that leadership certainly from members of his own grouping from the soft left, but largely he got votes which were lent to him by members of the more right-wing factions of the Labour Party. And certainly once it became clear that Jess Phillips and Lisa Nandy weren't viable candidates. And it came down essentially to a race between Keir Starmer and Rebecca Long-Bailey. The right-wing factions of the Labour Party, Progress, which is the sort of Blairite one, and Labour First, which is the sort of old
neoliberal entryist group.
Yeah, sort of Tom Watson-y kind of one. These two groups came together and formed a sort of coalition which they called Labour to Win, and that group backed Starmer to the hilt. And it's important to realise that even though Starmer himself isn't traditionally from the right of the party, his support within the PLP, and I think to a large extent within the wider party, although he did win with a lot of left votes, I think a lot of those people now regret voting for him. And I think his continuing support within the Labour Party largely comes from the right. And that means he has to play to them. And he could alternatively have chosen to extend an olive branch to Rebecca Long-Bailey and to the other members of the campaign group and to govern genuinely as a unity candidate. And if it came to a choice between the left and the right, he could have decided to go with the left. Indeed, it would be arguable that would be a more natural fit for someone of his political pedigree. He used to be a Trotskyite, for goodness sake, and he has consistently been a member of the left of the party, just the softer left rather than the harder left. It could very well be argued that it would have been a much more natural fit for him to govern as sort of the head of a coalition of the soft left and the hard left. He chose not to do that.
Yeah, he's making the choice,
he chose
even though he doesn't
instead,
have to align himself with the right.
Yes,
Now,
and that is
who
a
knows
choice.
what he really thinks on the inside. Maybe his instincts are more on the soft left. But he's certainly being... The way he's behaving as Labour Party leader is that he's choosing to serve as... to more closely ally himself with his allies on the right, rather than with any potential allies that he might have had on the left.
And I think with this action of suspending Jeremy Corbyn, he has burnt a lot of the remaining bridges on the left.
That is a big vibe that I'm getting from all the buzz that I'm hearing, is there are quite a lot of people like me who were previously trying to sort of straddle the I am very much on the left of the party, but I wanted to sort of give Keir Starmer a try to have the benefit of the doubt whenever he does something. And there are a lot of people who are not going to be doing that anymore.
No, because he's proven he doesn't deserve it.
No, he doesn't deserve it.
And I want to talk with you more on this issue, I think, on a future occasion, because we have other things to get to. But I do want to quickly say that I think this is a reason why organisation that on the left, which straddles the divide between the left of the Labour Party and left-wing organisations outside the Labour Party, is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's why I think Momentum made a bit of a mistake when they decided to become a sort of a subsection of the Labour Party, rather than what they could have been and what was the other option, which was to be a broader grouping of the left with members both within and without the Labour Party. And I say, I want to come back to this.
May, get involved with Labour politics, may endorse people, may try to campaign for things within the party, but aren't actually an affiliated organisation.
Yeah. I say, I want to come back to that on a future occasion, because I think it's an important topic. But I think possibly we should move on, unless you have anything more you want to say on that issue.
I'll say one more thing about this, which is that there's a big question around, do people that are on the left stay in the party or not? It is my position that we should.
Mm-hmm.
I was not settled on this position when this first happened. I have thought about it a lot, and I've considered it, and I think, yes, we should stay in the party. Thing number one is that if we mass self-purge, that's exactly what the right of the party wants. If they want us out of the party, they'll have to force us out. And they're very welcome to try. And they need to fight that process every step of the way. That's thing number one. Thing number two is we've got the NEC elections coming up. And this is just an important public service information, is that if you voted and then you quit, your vote is cancelled.
Right.
So, at the very least, stay until then, and then decide on what you want to do in future. And thing number three is, if you really can't stomach staying in the party, then join something like a union, where you still have affiliate membership of the Labour Party, but your membership dues don't go directly. So you can still vote in leadership elections and things like that. But the one thing that we shouldn't do, demobilise. This is not the moment to split up into a million different splinters of our ability to fight back.
I think that's a broadly sensible point. Yeah, I definitely think that your point about if you can't stomach being a full member of the party, affiliate membership via a union is definitely a good way to go. I mean, I would absolutely encourage joining a union if you can anyway, regardless, whatever unions are available to you in your sort of profession and your...
It does specifically have to be a union which is affiliated to the party.
Of course.
But that is most of them.
Yeah, most of the sort of big ones that aren't sort of international, like the IW. I've been considered, but I will say that that I'm not currently a member of the Labour Party.
Fair enough.
That's for the reason actually that I had some financial problems a little while ago and my membership lapsed. I'm certainly now thinking quite critically about whether I want to reapply.
Yeah, so I would say one more thing about being in the party, which is that don't stay in the party if it's going to make you pull your punches when it comes to the leadership, or self-censor, or think, well, I can't say that because I'm a Labour Party member, or whatever. Just stay in the party, and then tell the truth, fight for your politics, say what you mean what you say, all that stuff. And if the leadership wants to take enough of issue with that they're going to try and force you out of the party, then fight them on it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going when I was in sixth form and studying politics at A level, that I went up to Methodist Central Hall in London. and we watched some presentations by various political figures, sort of a real selection of groups. John Bercow, who was then the speaker, sort of kicked it off because it was sort of his sort of brainchild. And then there's Simon Hughes from the Liberal Democrats. There, I think David Blunkett was there. There were all sorts of people, but there was also Tony Benn, and this was a couple of months before he died. I don't know if I was one of the last people to see him speak publicly. It's certainly possible.
Maybe, yeah.
And I remember when he came out to speak, everyone in the room went quiet. Despite the fact that there'd been plenty of noise beforehand. Everyone in the room, including people who were certainly not members, listened in sort of rapt attention as he spoke. And he said that he basically thought that socialism couldn't thrive in the United Kingdom without some present. He thought that the Labour Party, whilst not perfect and whilst not a socialist organisation in and of itself, required socialist participation in it in order to be the force for good that it can be. And I don't know if I 100% agree with him on everything about that, but I definitely think that as long as there is any chance that socialists can exercise meaningful influence within the Labour Party, we should do our damnedest to do so.
Yeah. And also, there's a lot that we can do outside of the party. You can try and organise people, join a tenants union, try to resist evictions, environmental campaigns, try to get involved in local politics, whatever. There's loads of stuff that we can do.
Absolutely.
But, and it's, okay, put it this way. You can think of the left by contrast with something like UKIP or the Brexit Party, where they have formed not inside the Tory party and have had some success in dragging the Tory party to the right on specific issues. But the left is different to that kind of thing because we have to be serious about state power. We want to reform the British state fundamentally. We want to reform the society in a completely different mould. Whereas you just don't get that from Nigel Farage. What's his political economy? What's his take on housing? What's his take on climate change? It's nothing. Whereas, and we can achieve a lot outside of the party with all the things that I've just mentioned as well. But if we're going to achieve the political project that we want, we have to be serious about taking state power as well. And until someone has a vehicle which is more likely to achieve that than the Labour Party, I think we have to engage with it.
Yeah. No, I definitely think so. I mean, I'm a little more sympathetic, perhaps, to certain anarchist organising strategies of establishing sort of mutual aid groups, cooperatives, things like that, which I think definitely can be done and should be done, and don't need to interact with the Labour Party. But I've never been entirely persuaded by the sort of central anarchist claim that the state and capitalism can be overthrown simultaneously. I think it will probably be necessary, at least in some sense, to use part of the state in order to effect our overthrow of capitalism. And I'm open to being persuaded otherwise. I certainly have a lot of anarchist friends who have come close to persuading. I've never quite taken that leap myself.
Well, the thing is, if we, regardless of whether we try to use the state is, if we don't, the state's definitely going to try and stop us.
Oh, of course, yeah.
It's still there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As if you have a class war view of things, surely it's at the very least a front in the war, right? To extend the metaphor.
We're probably going to spend most of the remainder of this conversation talking about America. Before we do, I would quickly like to mention a couple of sort of rather chilling authoritarian moves, I would say. One of which by the government and one of which by the BBC. So the government issued some guidance, it was a couple of weeks ago now, I think, against the use of left-wing materials in schools, rather broadly constituted. So let's see if I can bring up sort of direct quotes, because that would be useful. Yes, so here's the direct quote. Schools should not, under any circumstance, produced by organisations that take extreme political stances on matters. This is the case even if the material itself is not extreme, as the use of it could imply endorsement or support of. Examples of what could be considered an extreme political stance included desire to abolish or overthrow democracy, capitalism, or to end free and fair elections. It also included a bunch of other things that you might more reasonably expect, such as racist language, endorsement of illegal activity. I mean, that's a bit iffy because that could encompass forms of civil disobedience. But specifically, I want to focus really on the idea that it is now against government guidance for schools to use, not even to endorse, but to use material by any group that wants to abolish or overthrow capitalism.
Even if the material doesn't talk about that. It just from an organisation which also has that stance.
It's going to make teaching the Russian Revolution quite tricky, I think.
Quite difficult, yes.
Yeah.
Or indeed British history. British political history.
Yeah, as John MacDonald pointed out, on this basis it will be illegal to refer to large tracts of British history and politics, including the history of British socialism, the Labour Party and trade unionism.
Yes. Keir Hardie, first Labour Party MP, Marxist.
Quite.
Not allowed to... What about George Orwell?
Yeah, I can't read 1984 now.
Yep. William Morris. All that lovely wallpaper.
Yeah, not allowed. Not allowed.
There's more to William Morris than wallpaper. It wasn't Jenga wallpaper, but
it was as wallpaper goes.
Yeah.
I will only wallpaper my home with wallpaper made by committed socialists. William Morris is the only wallpaper artist for me.
Yeah. Oscar Wilde, actually, come to think of it.
Yeah.
That's not. You can't teach that.
Well, they probably.
And in spectacles. The point. This seems to speak to a kind of an ignorance about what socialism is as a movement, how broad it is, how much of an intrinsically, fully endemic and integrated part of all human societies it has been. You can't ban people from talking about socialism without banning people from talking about a very, very large portion of all of history, culture, economics, social analysis, anything, right?
Yeah.
Is that clearly someone in whoever drafted this policy thinks of anti-capitalism as meaning some tiny irrelevant fringe group which they can basically and doesn't think of it as the enormous and incredibly influential movement that it is.
And insofar as they do think of it that way, they are probably hoping that these guidelines will catch.
Well, yeah, indeed.
Because I think there are certainly some people in the government who understand what Marxism is, to take an example, who understand that the Marxist reading of history, the Marxian view of economics, Marx, for goodness sake, he practically invented or co-invented sociology, modern sociology, It
is quite difficult sometimes to work out how much are they strawmanning their opponents and how much do they just simply not know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Hard to say.
It is.
Yeah. Something that struck me as ironic in this story is that they said that part of the point of this is to defend free speech.
Of course, yeah. You're also not allowed to use material from anti-free speech groups.
Enforcing ideological conformity to a particular view of how society must be organised, and deviation from that isn't allowed anymore. That for free speech.
Yeah. I mean, according to these guidelines, the fact of these guidelines' existence means it's now illegal, or now against guidance for schools to use any material provided by the British government under Boris Johnson, which I'm okay with that part, honestly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But no, it's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. The other thing I wanted to sort of bring into this was the recent. I think it's been described as a brouhaha, which I always love. I always love when I see that.
Something about British journalism that it has all these words which they don't use anywhere else.
A fracas.
Yeah, fracas.
Yeah.
Allegations is a big one as well.
Yeah,
I know that is a more general word, but British press love using it.
They do. They absolutely do.
Yeah. I suppose if you're a journalist rather than an author, you have to crank out a lot more material each week. So it's easy if you can just use stock phrases, I suppose. That wasn't supposed to be a joke. That was me trying to be.
That is a bit cynical, but I think
their difficult job that they have to do. Yeah.
No, yeah, I think you're right. So there was a story a couple of days ago, saying that essentially the BBC had released some guidelines of their own, which forbade their employees from attending pride parades or Black Lives Matter. And basically the idea behind this was that BBC has a responsibility to be impartial, and it could be said, therefore, that attending a march in support of LGBT rights or black rights, civil rights, could be considered taking a position on a controversial issue.
Yeah.
Now, it has since this, the head of the BBC has walked this back a bit. So, the Director General, Tim Davie, has said journalists could attend if they are not taking a stand on politicised or contested issues. And then there are some further comments, but essentially it does create this interesting set of ambiguities. I should point out that Tim Davie doesn't address the question of whether BBC journalists can attend Black Lives Matter marches. That isn't addressed at all. So as far as we know, that's still not allowed. As for Pride, they're allowed to go, but they must, quote, be mindful of ensuring that they do not get involved in matters which could be deemed political or controversial. Now, I don't want to be solipsistic here, but I, as a trans woman, I can read between the lines a little bit there. Because what that sounds like to me is, yes, you can go to Pride, but you can't say, I support trans rights, because trans rights is, according to the BBC, a politicised or contested issue, which is where they have to be impartial on it and invite a bunch of transphobes onto all of their programmes, because it's, controversial whether trans people deserve rights. And of course, this is complete nonsense, because it's also controversial in a lot of quarters about whether other LGBT people deserve rights and about whether black people or other people of colour deserve rights. But the BBC, in its sort of liberal bubble, sort of thinks that those are a bit more settled. For now, these people will use trans rights as a wedge issue, and in 5 years' time, if they carry on the way they're going,
these things can change very quickly.
Gay rights are going to be back in the sort of contested position they were in the 90s. That's what they want. Yeah. But at the moment, it's mostly, in this country at least, trans rights that are in the firing line, and that's what this reads like to me. Is that BBC staff can go to Pride as long as they don't start talking about the transes too much. And I think, again,
it's hard to say how much that's part of it, but it seems pretty clear to me that that's at the very least part of what they mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if they don't intend to mean it that way, that's how it'll be used.
Yeah, of course. To a large extent, your intentions are less important than the consequences of your actions. And I guarantee that will be part of the consequences.
Yeah. So, I think I might have a slightly unusual take on this, in that it's kind of just accurate to say that these things are politically contentious. Because they are politically contentious. Maybe Absolutely. They shouldn't be, but they are. What this says is not that the BBC should... But my position is kind of that the BBC shouldn't not be real about whether these things are politically contentious or not. Pretend that they're apolitical. When they are political. It's... So I think there are limits to how impartial a public service broadcaster kind of should be.
I agree.
If you work for the BBC... It is politically contentious to say that post-imperial and post-slave-owning societies, racism is endemic to them and is thoroughly conditions the way their institutions function. That's politically contentious, but it's also the sort of thing that you should be able to say, even if you have a job at the BBC, I think.
Absolutely. Right? It's something you should say. You have a responsibility to say. You have a duty to say, frankly.
Right. So I think
because there are people in this country that don't realise that, and they need to know.
Politically neutral broadcasting is... There's some truth to it and some value to the idea of it, but it is kind of actually not a thing. I think it's a kind of an impossible ideal to aim for. Everyone's human. Everyone has positions. Even if they're having to, they've got 20 minutes to give you the world. They're going to have to edit down the sheer amount of information of everything that has happened worldwide today, and they will have to make decisions as to what they what stories are important, what to emphasise about them. It is. Not only impossible, it would be meaningless to even imagine a politically neutral version of that. Now, that doesn't mean that the BBC should take the side of a particular political party in an election. Okay, they should be impartial in that sense. But that doesn't mean that they should pretend that their reporters aren't people and don't have politics of their own.
Yeah. No, absolutely. All speech is political.
Yeah, right.
All human action virtually has some political component. Politics is just, in its sort of most basic form, it's questions of power and decision making and allocation of resources and who gets to decide what we do and how we go.
So politics isn't everything, but everything is political. Politics is relevant to everything.
Yeah. It might not be the most important aspect of a given thing. If you and I decide to go to the pub, You
don't
know,
work out which pub's the most left wing before going.
Yeah, exactly. But that's a political question. If you want to go to the Shooting Star and I want to go to the Hobbit, we're going to have a back and forth about that. And one of us is going to get our way, and one of us is not. We can't go to both. Oh, we can't go to both, but we can't. We still have to decide which to go first. Yeah. Every interaction has a political component, and I am ripping this example off from another podcaster, Toby Buckle of the Political Philosophy podcast. So my apologies to him if he's listening.
You've credited him, it's fine.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a good example, right? Everything, no matter how sort of seemingly mundane, has a political component. And to pretend it doesn't is to do your audience a misjustice. And if you're someone like the BBC whose audience is, at least in theory, everyone in the UK plus a sizable percentage of English-speaking people overseas, that's a problem.
It's difficult, because there is obviously a difference between the kind of the fact that politics is relevant to everything, and therefore it's also relevant to the way the BBC reports on things. But also, there's a very clear difference between them and something like The Telegraph, which is partisan and political in a very different way.
Yes. But that's the thing, isn't it? It's the BBC. I've turned it to Sean Connery. R.I.P. Sean Connery. I've been possessed by his ghost.
That's what it is.
But the BBC should absolutely be non-partisan in the sort of narrow sense of they shouldn't sort of commit themselves to backing one political party over another. I think that's a good argument to be made that, the level of partisanship in the sort of mass circulation newspapers is frankly at a level of sort of circulation where it would be good to have some regulation of how partisan they can be, particularly at election times. Also. But partisanship and politics are not the same thing. And you can be non-partisan while still being political.
Yeah. There are ways that you can deal with it as well. So probably the most simple one is that the people who, political editor at the BBC and the people that are the news anchors and the people that make the decisions as to what they're going to report and how are people. They have political opinions. They should be honest about what they are, rather than pretending that they don't have them. Mm-hmm. They can also then try to be even-handed, even though to people that they disagree with. But the point is that they should be honest about what their perspective is, and then try to be impartial, and then we can judge how well they did.
Yeah, I mean, we should all aim for even-handedness and being, fair to our opponents. I'm a pretty committed socialist, but I don't intend to tell any lies about the Conservatives. And if I find myself to have said something that isn't true, and someone points that out to me, then I'll correct myself in future. I don't want to be lying about anything. I'm just interpreting, the information that I receive according to what I believe is correct.
And also give them credit when they do stuff that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought, as I said earlier, I thought the Northern Research Group got Rishi Sunak back to rights, and I'm sure Boris Johnson's done something right. I can't quite call to any examples to mind off the top of my head, but I'm sure that just has more to do with me being a little tired from.
So he hasn't been prime minister, although he's had a long career in politics
forever,
before that.
It seems like forever already.
Yeah, I know. Less than a year. No, maybe almost exactly a year now.
Yeah. I feel like Boris Johnson.
I think it was last year. For most of last year.
And then David Cameron. Do you remember David Cameron?
I remember David Cameron.
I sometimes feel like David Cameron was someone I only ever knew from history books. Yeah, and then at the same time, I also sometimes feel like he's still Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of slightly surprised that he's not. It's very weird.
I feel like he was only Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago. But also, it seems like he hasn't been Prime Minister for 100 years.
I think partly the pandemic is screwing
it's
with
the
sense of
pandemic,
time.
it must be.
Yeah,
and
I think it's just
that,
that, but I think it's partly. Hi, this is Katherine speaking while I'm editing this episode. It ended up being a very long one, so I decided to split it into two parts. So this will be the conclusion of part 1, and then part 2 will be following, hopefully tomorrow, when I have a chance to edit that. It ended up being about 4 hours of audio, and I'm very tired, but I shall get it to you as soon as I can. So for now, everyone, thank you for listening to Revolutionary Despatches. Be absolutely excellent to one another, and viva la revolution. See you soon.